Hi, welcome to the first video on my YouTube channel, where I will be covering various news topics and current affairs on this channel, looking at both economic and political news. As you can tell, the first video will be based on the souring British-Sino relations since a controversial national security law was implemented. This video will be split into three parts, those being the history of Hong Kong to provide a brief historical context, what the new law actually means for those impacted, and the British reaction in response to this breach of treaty, as well as the response of the Americans. History. Hong Kong was a colony of the United Kingdom, ruled by the governor appointed by the monarchy of the United Kingdom for 156 years, until 1997 when it was returned to Chinese sovereignty. China agreed to accept some conditions as is stipulated in the Sino-British Joint Declaration, such as the drafting and an adoption of Hong Kong mini-constitution, basic law before its return. The Hong Kong Basic Law ensured that Hong Kong will retain its capitalist economic system and own currency, the Hong Kong dollar, legal system, legislative system, and same human rights and freedoms as a special administration region of China for 50 years. Set to expire in 2047, the current arrangement has permitted Hong Kong to function as its own entity under the name Hong Kong China in many international settings, for example, the World Trade Organization and the Olympics. What it means for those impacted. The new law keys provision include that crimes of succession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign forces are punishable by a maximum sentence of life in prison. Damaging public transport facilities can be considered terrorism. Those found guilty will not be allowed to stand for public office. Companies can be fined if convicted under the new law. Beijing will establish a new security office in Hong Kong with its own law enforcement personnel, neither of which would come under the local authority's jurisdiction. This office can send some cases to be tried in mainland China, but Beijing has said it will only have the power over a tiny number of cases. In addition, Hong Kong will have to establish its own National Security Commission to enforce the laws with a Beijing-appointed supervisor. Hong Kong's chief executive will have the power to appoint judges to hear national security cases, raising fears about judicial autonomy. Importantly, Beijing will have power over how the law should be interpreted, not any Hong Kong judicial or policy body. If the law convicts with any Hong Kong law, the Beijing law takes priority. Some trials will be heard behind closed doors. People suspected of breaking law can be wiretapped and put under surveillance. Management of foreign non-governmental organizations and news agencies will be strengthened. The law will also apply to non-permanent residents and people from outside Hong Kong who are not permanent residents of Hong Kong. The British response to the breach. The Prime Minister said Hong Kong's freedom were being violated by a new security law and those affected would be offered a route out of the former UK colony. About 350,000 UK passport holders and 2.6 million others eligible will be able to come to the UK for 5 years, and after a further year, they will be able to apply for citizenship. British national overseas passport holders in Hong Kong were granted special status in the 1980s, but currently have restricted rights and are only entitled to visa-free access to the UK for 6 months. Under the government's plan, all British overseas nationals and their dependents will be given the right to remain in the UK, including the right to work and study for 5 years. At this point, they will be able to apply for settled status and after a further year seek citizenship. The US reaction was rather different. The Hong Kong Autonomy Act imposes sanctions on banks that do business with Chinese officials who are involved in cracking down on pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong. Mrs. Pelosi says the law was an urgently needed response to China's passing of its so-called national security law, which is purpose-built to dismantle democratic freedoms in Hong Kong. Before the bill was signed, the US had already begun eliminating Hong Kong's special status, halting defense exports and restricting the territory's access to high-technology products. I will be back over the next week discussing an economic topic that is relevant to our global situation today. If you enjoyed the video, please like, comment and subscribe and press the notification bell so you can be alerted when I post next. Take care and I'll see you soon. Hi, welcome to the first video on my YouTube channel, where I will be covering various news topics and current affairs on this channel, looking at both economic and political news. As you can tell, the first video will be based on the souring British-Sino relations since a controversial national security law was implemented. This video will be split into